In Florida, it's already law that if you're selling a house that has flooded in a storm, in a hurricane, whatever, you need to disclose that, which makes sense to me, right? It should be in the disclosures that you go through and you need to fill out, and you also need to sign all of that. That just makes sense. But they're now making it part of your deal if you're renting your house. So disclosing that to a potential tenant. And that also makes sense to me. To me, it's about time.
My house flooded. We're back in, so we're safe. Everyone was safe. That's all that really mattered. So lost a lot.
Since Hurricanes Helene and Milton, we've listened to how flooding washed away entire lives. But for some renters, the risk of rising waters came with no warning at all.
Those were really water events for a lot of the coast. It wasn't like we got hit with some of it, but it wasn't like where I'm at. I'm not in a flood zone. So I wasn't worried about it at all in any way, shape, or form. Those storms weren't a big deal to me. Ian was a big deal because that was like a direct hit. That was like landfall, ice storm, eye wall, all that, right? That was like, okay, this is this is as worse as it can get, right? The worst it could be. But I forget which one it was. One of them was just going up the coast, and we were getting a lot of the floodwaters, right? Because the storm sucks the water out and then it pushes it back in. And when it pushes it back in, more comes in than went out. And that's where it starts flooding everything. And that's bad. And if you're in a flood zone, that's what happens. Yeah.
Nothing about hurricanes, nothing. No flooding. They didn't tell me nothing. I just came and I moved in.
That's because up until Wednesday, landlords were not required by law to disclose any information about the history of flood damage. Something real estate attorney Stephen Hatchie says creates issues for not just tenants, but buyers too.
And a lot of landlords and unfortunately sellers take the incorrect position that they do not have the duty to disclose whether their property flooded.
It's already law in Florida.
I mean,
for those trying to sell their homes, they're required to share flooding history. But now...
Which I think is fair. I think that's fair. I think that you should have to put that in there. It's just what it is. Also, if you're buying a house in a flood zone, you should expect it, is the other thing. If you're buying a house in a flood zone, you should expect. If you're moving to Florida, if you live in Florida, you should expect hurricanes. If you're moving to a flood zone, you should expect flooding. Like, to me, it's a no-brainer, right? That makes sense. I don't see how that doesn't make sense. And that's not to say that every flood zone floods and that for Ian, for example, right? A lot of areas that were not in flood zones did flood. This is where they say you're in Florida, you're in a flood zone, right? Everywhere in Florida is a flood zone. There are areas that are, if you're on the water, if you're a certain vicinity to the coastline or to a canal or a river, if you're in a low-lying area, just all different things like that, where it's like, okay, this is where they have flood zones. It's like, okay, if you're in flood zone AE, or if you're in flood zone X, right? Just different. And there are others, right? But those are like the two big ones, right? Like if you're in AE, you're in a flood zone, you got to pay flood insurance if you have a mortgaged house, and you have a greater risk of flooding than if you're in flood zone X. I think there's also like a flood zone D, and there's other ones, but there's ones where it's like, okay, you're probably going to get flooded if something comes along.
It includes landlords as well, before tenants sign a lease. Hatchie says because of the recent hurricanes, most renters are already thinking to ask before signing, but that may not last forever.
Last year to now, did you have a lot of people coming in and saying like, hey, we weren't told?
I think it's just too new. I think down the road we will have those calls. Right now, we haven't had those calls because, again, the flooding is top of mind for those buyers or renters.
Yeah.
Now, fast forward 3 years from now, right? Buyers and tenants have short-term memories.
Right.
They may not go and ask, hey, did your property flood?
Now, some tips to look for if...
Yeah, I've heard that that's a thing in terms of just talking to people that have lived down here longer and talking about real estate and just cycles that people forget. You know, people, because we got hit with Ian and there was a certain amount of people that just left, whether it's like they don't want to deal with it anymore or they can't recover in a lot of ways and they need somewhere to go. So they move back up north with family or somewhere, wherever their family is, just different things like that. And again, a lot of people just being like, I'm so done. And I get it. That was definitely that storm. That was definitely that storm where you're just like, I don't want to deal with this when I'm 70. I don't want to deal with it. This is crazy. Now, okay, anywhere you move, you have to deal with something because no place is perfect or avoids some type of natural disaster type of situation, whether it's a tornado or a hurricane or an earthquake or blizzards and all, you know, just whatever it is. But what are you going to deal with? Pick your heart, as they say. People have short-term memories. People were saying that have been here longer that, yep, this will happen. It'll get bought up. And then you just go a few years without a hurricane or without a direct hit. People forget, they come down and they buy, and it happens all over again, basically. Because even if you look at the history of hurricanes in Florida, which I've done many times since moving here, it's like there have been periods where you don't get anything like a direct hit. You may get like a tropical storm or something like that. That's not generally a big deal. What's really a big deal is like a Cat 3 and up, but really, really Cat 4 and up. I mean, I know that I think that Ian was a 4, but I feel like people that were in Ian thought it was a 5. They were like, I don't care what they say. That was a 5. That was the most hellish thing I've ever experienced in my life. And I've been in tons of them, right? I was in Andrew and that was worse. I was in Charlie and that was worse, right? Tons of people like that. Tons of people like that. Because it was crazy. It was crazy. And no two storms are the same. That's the other part of it. No two storms are the same. So Charlie, just for example, because Charlie and Ian, the paths were pretty similar. Charlie, from what I wasn't in Charlie, I was in Ian. From what everybody tells me who's been in Charlie, which there's a ton of people out here who are in both, Charlie was really fast. It was really powerful, but it was fast. It came and it went in like an hour or two or however long. Ian lasted all day because it was such a slow moving storm. It was really powerful and huge, right? Charlie was much smaller and tighter. Ian was way bigger and really slow moving. I wasn't in the area. I went to a relative's house somewhere safer. My house was in the storm. It was as in it as it could have been. But I just remember we were just glued to the TV forever. It lasted forever. It was all day. It was all day long. All day. It was at least 12 hours. It was crazy. But yeah, you should disclose this type of stuff. Of course you should. I think that's just right. That's just, they have disclosures for a reason. This should be disclosed. Would it take a hit on your house? Yeah, it probably will. Right? It probably will, of course. If you're buying a house and this house flooded and that one didn't, which one are you going to go for? I suppose that depends on what your risk tolerance is and what the prices are, right? But I'm probably going to go with the house that didn't flood. I think it should be disclosed. I just think that that's fair. That's just what it is.
If you are looking to rent, is looking for stuff like new drywall, new painting, and making sure you're asking if you are in a flood area. And we'll also have more information on the new law linked on TampaBay28.com. For now in Hillsborough County, I'm Blake Phillips, Tampa Bay 28.
Okay, so yeah, are they making it so that it has to be in the lease in some type of way? Like, how does that work for renters? I mean, if you're renting, you should know if you're moving to a flood zone or not. You should still know that. You absolutely should still know that. And maybe don't move to a bottom floor, if possible. That doesn't absolve you of risk because the roof can tear off. Or if you're in like a middle floor, if there's 3 floors in your building and you're in the middle floor or something like that, if the roof falls off and then, you get leaks. I've lived in places where the ceiling starts leaking. Yeah, I had a place in Boston where I was living in the basement and there's just the ceiling just starts leaking. And I'm like, and you got to call luckily I didn't own that place, I had to get taken care of, all that kind of course it can happen. Of course. A lot of people lost their roofs in Ian. A lot of people. And I'll say it again, the roofs that held up the best were metal roofs. I don't see how that isn't just law. Every house down here needs a metal roof. Like, you cannot have a shingle roof. It needs to be metal. Even the old, that was the biggest seller. The metal roofs that clearly were decades old, probably more than 30 years old, were still 95% fine. Maybe a little bit tore up, but it was still there, or it was a little bit bent or whatever, but it was still there. Like, there was no metal roof house that I saw that probably needed a blue tarp type of deal, where those shingle houses, forget it. No way. Yeah, I think it's a good thing. I'm surprised that it hasn't been a law already. You would think that would be something that needs to be disclosed. So, and for sure that if it has to be disclosed, if you're buying and selling real estate, it should also have to be disclosed if you're renting. Something like this, at least. I mean, other things, I suppose it would depend on what it is. I guess I would need examples of what it would be, whether or not it's like, does a renter need to know that? Maybe not. But something like this that would affect their things. Yeah, they probably need to know that. Do they need to know if a house had mold? Like, just as an example, I'm just thinking up that example right now. I mean, if it's been remediated, which it should have been remediated, then no, I don't think they need to know that. It's like they don't need to know that it's been remodeled or any of that, any of that kind of stuff. They don't need to, they could see it. So I don't know. That's a thing. But flooding, yeah, that's kind of important. I think that's important. I think that's a really important one.